our education system, and I'm so sorry to say this, it is just beyond pathetic, sir.
So there are two problems here.
Economist Sanjeev
Sanyal, who many would better know as the principal economic advisor to the government.
Sir, what is this Hindu rate of growth?
So instead of blaming bad policy and calling it the Nehru rate of growth, so let's blame it on India's cultural roots.
Germany just has a population of 8.38 crores, and yet their exports stand on the upwards of $1.6 trillion. And here we have a population of 1.4 billion, and yet our exports barely touch 800 billion. Sir, why is there such a big gap, and what are we doing to fix it?
I could give a long lecture on how we can improve this.
The MSME sector of India employs 100 million people. It contributes close to 50% to our exports, and yet it is one of those sectors which is just struggling for capital. Why is that, sir? What was it like to do business in India in the 1980s, and how is it far different today in 2024?
No amount of lecturing will teach you economics better than having your fingers burnt in a market crash. Let me tell you this.
Sir, I'd actually disagree with that lecture thing, and I'll tell you why. Hi everybody, this is a conversation that I had with the economic advisor to the Prime Minister himself, who goes by the name Sanjeev Sanyal. And this entire episode involved a very heavy production, and we were able to bring this episode to life only because of the kind support of our sponsors, Build School. Build School is a specialist in AI education. Now people, we all know that AI is changing the world. But what if I told you that AI is actually making the dream of achieving financial freedom and making money on the internet very easily possible for professionals? Recently, I heard about Vatsal, who is an indie hacker, and he is one of the best in the game. He has transformed his ideas into reality using AI and no code. And today, he earns close to 1 crore rupees per year. And Build School is hosting Vatsal himself for a masterclass where he would be sharing how he builds products using AI and no code, which makes him almost 1 crore a year. Now, this is usually a paid workshop, but for the first 1,000 Think Schoolers, this workshop is absolutely free. Vatsal's journey is a proof that you can leverage AI to transform your life, which is why Growth School is backing him. Vatsal will teach you everything about how to turn your ideas into reality with frameworks from ideation to monetization. Now, imagine turning your dream projects or ideas into reality with the help of AI. Does this sound interesting to you? If yes, then don't let your ideas remain just ideas. Act now, seize this free opportunity, click the link in the description to join the masterclass for free. And now, on with the episode. Good morning, sir.
How do you do?
All good, sir. Welcome to the Indian Business Podcast, sir. I've been watching a lot of your interviews and podcasts, and I really admire the way you explain your answers using examples and case studies and data points. So today what I want to do is I want to take this conversation further and deeper and try to understand what exactly is the definition of great governance and what is India's approach to become a $10-20 trillion economy, and what are the most important hurdles that we face as a country, and what are we doing to overcome those hurdles to become a $10 trillion economy. And there's no better person than you to answer these questions, sir. So my first question is coming from the economic story of India, sir. I remember that when Modi ji went to the US, he specifically mentioned that the last time I was in US, India was the 10th largest economy. But today, India is the 5th largest economy. To most people, these may just seem like numbers. And a large segment of the population also believes that we have become the 5th largest economy merely because of our population. But sir, you have been a participant in the economic story of India. So sir, what exactly have we done so differently in the past 10 years that we've taken this big leap to become the 5th largest economy?
So, first of all, we need to understand these numbers and let me put them in context. So, when we began liberalizing our economy, I become serious about economic policy making in 1991. We were only a $270 billion economy. So we were that small. It then took us 16-17 years till 2007-8 to become a $1 trillion economy. Okay, that long how it took. From there, it took us 7 years, okay, to 2014-15 to become a $2 trillion economy. Now, from there, it should have been faster. But then, we took about about another 7 years odd, partly because of COVID, to become a $3 trillion economy, which happened in 21-22. Then we added another $1 trillion in just 3 years. So we were a $3 trillion economy in 21-22. This year, in the year 2024-25, we'll be close to $4 trillion. So another $1 trillion being added in 3 years, a little over 3 years. So the reason I'm making this point to you is this: people forget the power of compounding. Okay, China, everybody says, "Oh my God, this is now a $19 trillion economy, impossibly big." Do remember that they got here through compounding, and people learned compound interest rates in school, but they forget how powerful it is. In the first few years, it doesn't seem to matter, and then a few years later, it just blows up. So this is the important thing. So this power of compounding, what we are benefiting from. This number, of course, is a nominal number, not a real number, but our economy last year grew by 8.2%. It is growing at double digits in nominal dollar terms. And this year again, it will go by 7% in real terms, in again, probably over 10% in nominal dollar terms. The point I'm making is this 10 percentage point compounding is massively powerful. So we are now at $4 trillion. It will take us a little over 2 years, somewhere in 2007 or so, we will become a $5 trillion economy. Along the way, we will go past Japan, which we should do this year or early next year, and then another 2 years from there to go past Germany, to become the world's third largest economy. So what I'm trying to say is, this is basically that compounding process. Now, of course, people will say that even when we are the world's third largest economy, $5 trillion economy, etc., we will be, per capita terms, poor. No doubt about it. We'll be the fifth largest economy now, then third largest economy. But we already are, by some margin, the world's largest population. So one divided by the other, not surprisingly, the number is small. And it's barely around about $3,000 per capita. Remember, US is at $80,000 per capita. Even if you adjust for purchasing power, we will still be at a little over $10,000 per capita. Okay, so we are a poor economy. Not as poor as we used to be, admittedly. We used to have barely, $330 or something per capita in 1991. So from there, we have grown a little less than 10 times. So no doubt that we are much less poor than we used to be. That extreme kind of poverty I remember from my childhood is now restricted to much smaller areas and a much smaller segment of society. But yes, we are still very, very poor. And the solution to this is to keep this compounding process going. Everybody got here through compounding. We are not going to be an exception. China got through it. The West went through this compounding process. They just started in the 19th century, through the 20th century, over a long period of time. We probably don't want to spend that much time getting here, but even if we go for an East Asian model, it was still compounding. So the first point I want to make to you is, no matter how you think about this is about compounding. And we have now reached a critical mass where that compounding is really beginning to count. And so that point I was making is that we are adding that extra $1 trillion faster and faster. And that's basically the point we have reached. Now, some people will say, and the point you were making, is that this is only happening because we have a large population, we are very poor, and so on. Well, utter rubbish. We had a large population and we're even poorer in the 1960s and 70s. We didn't grow. We only began to get going serious about growth in the 90s. Why? Because we began to have sensible policies, right? So the point I'm making is that sensible policies matter. Simply having population doesn't get you there. Simply being poor and therefore having a catch-up doesn't get you there. Not only forget India's own history of being very poor. Well, there are many countries in the world which are much poorer than us. Much of Africa, there's Pakistan, Afghanistan. Why aren't they growing faster than us? So to make this case that we are growing faster because we are poor is utter rubbish. We have been even poorer in the past and we didn't grow.
So what exactly have we done differently in the past 20 years because of which this compounding is happening?
Little more than 20 years. It really began in the 90s. The first step, obviously, was to, with the 1991 reforms, I would count it as just like 1947 was political freedom. 1991 begins the journey to economic freedom. So we first of all broke out of this extremely corrosive socialist framework. And of course, it happened not because we suddenly changed our worldview. It happened because we had a crisis and, the Soviet bloc collapsed and, things changed. But anyway, nonetheless, since we began to introduce sensible policies, first thing that happened is that we began to withdraw the Indian state from things it should not do. Okay. So that entire licensing Raj, that entire thinking process, and allowing the private sector innovation and all these kinds of things, that is a very important reason why we began to grow. And that process has taken us 30 years. And let me say that we even today are reluctant reformers. But that process has gathered pace and we have become more and more bold in what we have done. So, for example, if you go back to the 90s, we did do, in 91, 92, maybe up to 93, we did a whole bunch of bold reforms. Once the economy recovered from the crisis, we actually stopped doing reforms.
Really?
Yes. So it's quite striking that in the second half of the 90s, we did some reforms, the odd one here, there, but we actually didn't do reforms. We got growth. By about 98, 99, that growth momentum that we had got from that first round of it, that began to falter. Okay. So it's only again under the Vajpayee regime that another round of reforms happened. And that generated the growth that you got in from around 2002 to 2007, 26 or thereabouts. Then, unfortunately, after the Vajpayee regime, again few reforms were done. So one of the problems is that we do a bunch of reforms, we get growth because of it, and then we say, okay, now things are fine, so we don't have to do any more reforms. So again, by 2007-8, we got the global financial crisis, but here in India, the benefits of the Vajpayee reforms also then ran out, and we hadn't done reforms. Then, for the period from 2007 to 13 or so, instead of doing reforms, we tried to keep growth going by essentially pumping up the banking sector and encouraging it to go out and give random loans. So what happens as a result of that? We do get some growth. We do recover from the shock of the global financial crisis. But because it is based essentially on expansion of the monetary and fiscal and financial expansion, and it is not based on actual supply side reforms, what happens is that by about 2013-14, our banking system begins to be questioned, our macro fundamentals begin to wobble. You will remember, we began to be counted as the fragile five and so on. So again, growth begins to kind of be under pressure. Anyway, that decade of the 2010s, the teens, saw global growth slowing generally because everybody had problems with their financial sector. So we were, first of all, in a slower global growth environment. Our own banking system then had to be cleaned. And so in the years 17, 18, 19, we went through a fair amount of pain because we had to clean up our banking system. Something I was also one of the participants in it. Many others also contributed to this cause. Several RBI governors, Deputy Governor Acharya, Deputy Governor Vishwanathan, Deputy Governor Jain. There were banking secretaries here who did a lot of great work. There was Anjali Duggal, after her, a banking secretary, Rajiv Kumar. and so on. And so I'm mentioning them because you see, very often people forget the contributions of people who are one layer below the top layer. So of course there was contributions from Governor Patel, Governor Das, and so on, and the Finance Minister Jaitley, Prime Minister, all at the very top level. But I'm mentioning the layer below that also, who put in a lot of effort. And then the banking system got cleaned up. And simultaneously, we did one major reform, the GST. I mean, you can complain about the GST all you want, but the fact is, it is a dramatic improvement on whatever was there before. I'm not saying that the current system cannot be improved. I think it can be. It needs a lot of simplification. But whatever it is, with all its flaws, it's a dramatic improvement on what was there before. We introduced the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So, this whole business of carrying around defunct companies of the past and putting them in BIFR, which is basically a warehouse for dead companies. Finally we began to shut down these companies. And large companies were shut down, whether it's Jet Airways or these whole bunch of steel companies, and so on. So then of course, for the banks that was good because you created credit, imposed creditor rights. But generally speaking, for the economy, it's good because you are giving economic assets from, and these are productive economic assets, from an inefficient user to an efficient user, and so on. So there is this change and big bunch of reforms that happened, which, of course, there was a period, of course, then had the 2 years of COVID that we had to go through. Then what happens is that on the other side of it, because we had done all these reforms, cleaned the banks, we begin to benefit from all of those. And so the important part of the thing is that we need to keep doing these reforms. Okay? We have to be unapologetic about ease of doing business, ease of living, simplifying the thing. And I am a big advocate of something called process reforms. You see, everybody loves big structural reforms, but it's actually a lot of the gain in efficiency comes from small process reforms, nuts and bolts, this process here, this rule here. And if you go and look at the articles I write or the speeches I give, I talk a lot about these nuts and bolts that small changes you have to keep changing. And so those are the things that suddenly get your system to grow. And none of them will hit headlines, but somebody has to pay attention to them and keep changing them. And, while I am a big advocate of certain kind of structural reforms, I have written extensively about and I have participated in formulating a lot of these smaller changes, which people in that little sector will know about, but widely people may not know.
Okay. So if I were to summarize your answer, it is we went from being a state-run economy to a market-run economy because of liberalization. We got rid of our socialistic frameworks. And then we introduced several policies like IBC. And in the process of that, we also stagnated with our policy reforms, because of which we entered into a banking crisis. And then once we got in IBC and reforms like that of GST, today we are in a we are much better off as compared to the past. Sir, I want to go a little deeper into this market-run economy and state-run economy. And you mentioned the socialistic framework. Because we were born in the 1990s, we are not able to appreciate the market that we exist in today. So could you please throw some light on what was it like to do business in India in the 1980s, and how is it far different today in 2024?
So the best way to understand this is get up one morning, see if you can find somebody who owns an old Ambassador car, preferably one before they introduced the Isuzu engine in the 90s. Okay. So a really old Ambassador car, just try and drive it. Okay? You will realize what the problem is. I mean, the gear shift is not smooth. You need to 5 times to get into the right gear. It rattles when it goes. Its speed is up and down. It'll break down on you all the time. And as I said, the ones that are still around are mostly the ones from the 90s on Isuzu engines. Try and find if there's one of them left from the pre-Isuzu Ambassador car. They were awful. Okay. And when I, as a teenager, finally encountered a Maruti 800, it was an absolute revelation.
Maruti 800?
Maruti 800.
Okay.
That was the major sociological event of my childhood. Okay. Was the Maruti 800, because suddenly you had a car that actually functioned. Okay. People don't understand this, and since very often they don't remember the improved Ambassador, which even after the improvement, it wasn't a great car. Okay. But you should really go back to the pre-Isuzu engine Ambassador to understand what a dramatic shift it was. Now, this doesn't mean that after the 1991 reforms, we became a great place to work. There's a lot to be done about our ease of doing business, etc. But what has happened is at least there is a mindset that came that doing business was a good thing. And that at least some of the state chief ministers, etc., began to think, yes, maybe attracting business is a good thing. I mean, these are radical ideas at one point in time. Because
radical?
They were radical ideas. Just like you hear, some of that rhetoric is still around.
Okay, that business is a bad thing.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. You hear it in a diffuse way as Adani, Ambani, etc. But when I was growing up, it wasn't Adani, Ambani, it was Tata Birla. So you would hear, oh my God, this is bad because Tata Birla will take advantage of it or something. And remember, I grew up in 1980s Kolkata, okay, 70s and 80s Kolkata, where they actually threw out business. Threw them out. So people don't realize that before Bangalore became the tech hub of India, most of these international tech companies and people with technology-oriented sort of businesses or inclinations, they used to be based out of Kolkata.
Okay.
I remember in the 80s, there being actual large-scale strikes against the computerization. And they remember first generation of computerization happened. I mean, proper computerization is being attempted. That it is... Computers are going from some esoteric thing in a few industries or in university or scientific labs or something to something that is being more widely used in the 80s. There was a huge pushback, as a result of which the industry actually moved to Bangalore.
Why, sir?
Because, as I told you, and this is why you have to understand the framework in which you think about an issue. The narrative framework of how you think about something is absolutely critical. In the narrative framework of socialist India, but specifically concentrated in communist-ruled West Bengal, the narrative framework was that you cannot grow the cake. It can only be divided. So it was only about whether you divide the cake between the computer and the incumbent clerk or whoever was going to get replaced by the computer. The idea that you could upskill the person and use the computer to do more things simply wasn't a part of the conversation.
So you're saying that in the 1980s, business was a bad thing. And I also read somewhere, sir, that back then the tax rates were so high that the highest tax slab was somewhere around 93.5%.
No, it was 97% plus.
97%?
In the 1970s. And it was brought down significantly after that. But, that was kind of a part of that entire thinking process, yes.
So the government was thinking we'll just tax the rich and then pass on the welfare to the poor.
No, it helped them. Basically, you have to understand the political economy. That was the rhetoric, Garibi Hatao and so on. But this is really about political power.
Okay.
And so what were they trying to do? Essentially, the political establishment and the bureaucratic establishment of that time essentially ganged up and they said, look, let us introduce power on the whole system. How do we do it? We nationalize whoever we can. So, we'll nationalize the airlines, we'll nationalize the banks. What are you basically doing? You are introducing control over the whole system. And it was well understood even at that time that all of this was a bad idea. That is one of the funny things about this is that this idea of called license Raj that we use even to this day is not a term that we came up with after we had done it and it turned out to be a bad idea.
Okay.
License Raj is a term used in the 1950s where Rajaji, when he's trying to warn the political establishment, more generally the public, that this is a bad idea. So there are economists like Shenoy who are warning people that this is going to lead to bad outcomes. And it does lead to bad outcomes. So in the 1960s, our economy basically falls apart. We have to, go begging to the Americans for food aid. And the 70s, our economy again collapses. We have very high inflation.
Yeah.
That's why the emergency, one of the big reasons the emergency was introduced was because there was huge amount of turmoil. Okay. And it continued into the 80s, this kind of thinking. Although by the mid 80s, finally, we began to relent and, Rajiv Gandhi began to ease things up a little bit. But point of the matter is, this was the thinking process. So you have to understand that this had a lot to do with the politics of the time and the imposition of control, and by the political leadership of that time that did not want alternative sources of power. And so the nationalization of banks has, even at that time, was thought to be a bad idea. In fact, people do not understand that even earlier in the 1950s, the LIC that you see today is the result of a large number of nationalization of insurance companies, which were then amalgamated into LIC. And within few months of that happening, there was a massive scandal called the Mundra scandal.
Okay.
In which it was discovered that this LIC, now big entity, its monies were being used for all kinds of political purposes, to fund politically linked business. And so there was a big scandal. Interestingly, the then Prime Minister's son-in-law is the one, Feroz Gandhi, who is the one who in the parliament brought it up.
Okay.
And the then finance minister, TTK, had to actually resign. And it was a big embarrassment for the Prime Minister, especially since it was his son-in-law who had brought it up. And so he never spoke to his son-in-law ever again.
Damn. So concentration of
So this
power.
is one of the reasons, by the way, interestingly, Feroz Gandhi's name never comes up in any conversation. Because Feroz Gandhi was the person who actually opposed some of this, clear grab of resources that his own, in-laws were doing.
Interesting. So, sir, it was concentration of power by the government and then spreading this narrative that business was bad, which eventually stunted our growth. Is that it?
Absolutely. And then when it all went bad, they then said it was the Hindu rate of growth. So what exactly is going on here? This is again a part of narratives. Okay, so 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s happen. You have now run this system based on this socialist thing. It has now failed for a significant period of time. And by this point in time, you already have Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, etc. They have a different, who have changed their policies and are succeeding. So it is quite obvious by the late 70s that this socialist system is a disaster. So now who do you blame it? So you blame it, Hindu rate of growth. It must be because, those Hindus and their social customs are all outdated, and it is because of them.
So what is this Hindu rate of growth?
So the Hindu rate of growth is we were growing at 3.5%, and that time the population growth was 2%. So basically there was no per capita growth that was happening. So instead of blaming bad policy and calling it the Nehru rate of growth, so let's blame it on India's cultural roots. So the entire thing was then blamed as the Hindu rate of growth.
Okay.
You'll see this term still used.
Yeah.
But why was it used? It's a lot of how you create, narratives about whose failure it is. It is not the failure of socialist policies. So the narrative that is being sold, it's not that Nehru and Nehruvian policies failed India. It is India and its cultural roots that failed Nehru.
Okay.
So that is how.
That, sir?
Of course, that's all politics. Basically, when you failed, you blame the victim.
And how did people believe it? I mean, what is
you should ask the intellectuals of that time.
Okay.
Why they were. And in fact, one of the things that I keep pointing out to you, that even though it had clearly failed, and by the 80s it was more than little visible, and even, in many of Rajiv Gandhi's statements, you can see that, he is acknowledging that this system had broken down. I mean, he makes a statement that for every rupee that the government spends on welfare schemes, 85 paise disappear, so 85% leakage. So he's acknowledging that this is happening, but still the intellectual class continues to support these bad ideas because in many ways they are the beneficiaries of that system. Because the elite of that system is largely bureaucracy and so on. And they are the beneficiaries of the system. Similarly, the business class of that time, they may crib about various things. But the fact of the matter is they are protected from all kinds of competition.
True.
Yeah, so never confuse capitalism with the personal interests of capitalists. Okay, so when in 1991 our economy finally collapses and we are forced to do these reforms, be very clear that the intellectual class of that time, and I was at university at that time, they were not in favor of the reforms. There were very, very few economists of that time who thought it was a good idea. They all argued against it. But importantly to remember, even the business community, large, not everybody, but largely, they also argued against it, even though you would think they were beneficiaries from it. They are not. Business community as a whole benefits because it will grow, etc. But individual business does not because they now will face competition. Yeah. If you're producing inefficient, poor quality products and are able to get away with it, you are now afraid that, new competitors will come, foreign competitors will come, and you will not be able to compete. So, in fact, ironically, Indian business also argued against it.
Interesting. So now I want to come back to 2024. And now that we are in the capitalist era in the Indian economic story, while we've become the fifth largest economy in the world, I think, sir, we have to rethink our benchmarks and we have to get rid of all the Pakistan narrative and the socialist era narrative. And we have to stop comparing ourselves with those entities. And what I believe is the right comparison to make would be developed countries like Japan and Germany. And I was just doing a case study on Germany and I found something absolutely stunning. Germany just has a population of 8.38 crores. And yet, their exports stand on the upwards of $1.6 trillion. And here, we have a population of 1.4 billion. And yet, our exports barely touch 800 billion. So why is there such a big gap and what are we doing to fix it?
So first of all, we have to remember that for a very long time, as I said, this is also a part of that legacy that we were not integrated with the world. So we had this import substitution mindset. And of course it protected all kinds of internal interests. So we kept ourselves closed. It's only in the 90s we began to open it up. And fair enough, we did it carefully. I think we were correct in doing that because we opened things up too fast, you will get chaos. So we took our time to do it, which was fine. But I think we then reached a point where we are now, even that number that you gave is of recent origin.
True.
You have to add to it the fact that we also became competitive in services, which is partly an artifact of the fact that we liberalized our economy in the post-digital age. So therefore, that is a market that would not have been available to other countries. So we have taken advantage of that. But in manufacturing, I would argue we can do a lot better. And that requires us now to be much more aggressive and you will see that we talk a lot about manufacturing. And even though there are people who argue that India should somehow just use the services pathway, this government has been strongly stating over and over again that, why should we give up manufacturing? There are many benefits to this. One is that, we happen to be unique in that we have a domestic market that allows leveraging up. We are one of the few countries which actually have the skills to absorb this. We already have many of these big companies here, and there is this general China plus one environment. However, that is the good side. The bad side is the world economy is not growing. So it's always easier to grab market share in an environment that is expanding rather than one that is stagnant. So the Chinese had the advantage that they did this in the 90s and 2000s when the world was globalizing very rapidly, and therefore, in an expanding environment, you can grow fast anyway. Now we are in a stagnant global environment, relatively speaking, and we have to grow in that. Now, I'm not saying it'll remain like this forever. I'm sure the world goes through cycles. We'll also get a good phase at some point in time. But while we are waiting for the cycle to turn, we have to keep investing on the supply side of the economy. That requires that we invest into being competitive. There's many things we need to do. First of all, we need to get our trade-oriented infrastructure up and running.
Okay. Trade-oriented infrastructure.
Yeah. So that means that, our highways, our airports, our business processes in the customs, our ports are up to speed. And you can see that we are building, for example, our ports have become a lot more efficient than they used to be a decade ago.
True.
Radically. Similarly, we are building this massive new port in Vadhavan, just north of Mumbai. Our airports are not only a lot better than what they used to be, but also we are building these brand new airports in many places, but two really big ones, one in Navi Mumbai, one east of Delhi in Greater Noida, and so on and so forth. So that is one part of it, just getting the physical infrastructure up and running. The second thing is that we need to get our business processes up to speed. Some progress has been made in this, and I will give you some examples of how things have improved. For example, patents. Okay, just 6-7 years ago, we used to do just 10,000 patents a year. That's the number of patents we used to grant, and more than half of it used to go to multinational companies, which were just regularizing their patents in India. So they are not real innovations in India's context.
Okay.
In the last financial year, 23-24, we did 1 lakh patents a year. So in 7 years, we have increased the number of patents granted by the system 10 times.
Okay. How, sir?
By improving processes and doing a whole bunch of things. And I've written extensively about it. You can read about it.
Okay.
Okay. So that's one kind of, I'll give you another kind of process reforms. Everybody talks about ease of entry. But actually, for an economy based on creative destruction, you need ease of exit as well.
Ease of exit.
Yes. How easily can you shut down a company? And I'm not talking about companies that are shut down because they go bankrupt. Those are forcibly bankrupt. I'm talking about voluntary shutdowns. In fact, 70-80% of companies that shut down, in fact, maybe even more, maybe 90% of companies that shut down in any 1 year are not shutting down because they went bankrupt. Okay. They're shutting down for a variety of reasons. The guy who's running the company has got fed up of running it because whatever, it's grown old, his son doesn't want it. Or they can be a large company that is shutting down a subsidiary. Any number of reasons why, for entirely voluntary reasons, companies get shut down every year. Now, earlier, this was a real headache to shut down a company, even when nobody was objecting to it. It was not like there was a case that was outstanding, or there was some outstanding, some amount, or there was some dispute. No. There were large numbers of companies which everybody agrees it should be shut down, but it would take years to shut them down.
Why?
Well, the processes were ridiculous.
For example?
You had to get NOCs from various people. You needed your company's name to be published in the newspaper. That for some reason would be delayed. And there's a whole list, and I've also written about this extensively.
Okay.
Now, about a year ago, we created something called CPACE.
Okay.
Which the Ministry of Corporate Affairs created. They simplified all the processes and they've automated it. Guess how long it takes now? So what used to take years, 3-4 years, now takes 90 days.
90 days.
90 days. We are the fastest place in the world to shut down a company voluntarily if there's no dispute.
Interesting.
Okay. So why I'm bringing this up to you is that you can dramatically change something, you pay attention to the processes. So we are not paying enough attention to these processes. There are thousands of them. Our metrology, legal metrology laws. These are the laws relating to labels and weights and measures and things. We need to simplify them. We need to, there's a lot of unnecessary criminalization of things which lead to harassment, rent seeking, and all kinds of things by officials. All kinds of things happen. Okay. So we need to simplify them and create. Similarly, you take our income tax system. The rules are still very complicated, but the process, thanks to being put online, has become radically easier. The refunds come through much more quickly. Things are all connected. We have anonymized it So hopefully the amount of random harassment, etc., has gone down. So point I'm making to you is that we are at every step we are trying to improve. It is not that this is perfect, and with every change some other wrinkle appears also. So we have introduced the GST. We certainly a dramatic improvement on the plethora of rules, state level octroi, all kinds of garbage we used to have has gone. But there are all kinds of kinks in the system even today. People keep complaining about the GST system. There are kinks in the website, doesn't work for some reason. Similarly, in the IPR regime, we have solved significantly for patents, but there are problems with the trademarks guys. So we are continuously trying to improve. But there has to be a single-minded attention to these process reforms, because I think everybody loves grand structural reforms. But in fact, much of the friction in the system is in the process.
Interesting. So you're saying that we first need trade-oriented infrastructure and we need process reforms.
Large numbers of them, and as a matter of course, that every day we get up, make things better.
Which will help us improve ease of doing business.
Absolutely. That is ease of living also. Not just ease of, many of these things relate to just day-to-day living. I mean, the ease with which, for example, and the integrity of the process by which I get myself a passport, a driving license. All of these things have hopefully become significantly better in recent years. Not just making it easier, the integrity of the system has to be still there. I mean, you still want to make sure the guy who gets a driving license actually knows how to drive. So the integrity of the system is also important.
So here's where the narrative of red tapeism comes into play, right? Could you please explain what exactly is red tapeism, sir, and how is it hindering our economic growth?
So this is the point I was making all this while. Process reform is about getting rid of red tape.
Okay. So I think one of the major reasons why India also lacks in achieving exponential manufacturing growth is also because we are competing with China in terms of prices, whereas Germany is competing with quality. Because I was reading about the Mittelstand companies in Germany, and I saw this map of Germany where Mittelstand companies were spread all across the country, and 80% of these companies were located in those towns which had a population of less than 1 lakh. And Germany, as of 2022, had 1,400 world market leaders. So these companies were not market leaders in Germany, they were market leaders across the world. And when I looked deeper into what was the fundamental reason why they were market leaders, I understood that they have hyper specialized in doing one thing. For example, there's a company that just manufactures fridges. That's all. There's a company that just makes wires. And there's also a company which has been making beer for a century. But they do it so well that they do not have to compete on the basis of price.
Well, I think that's a simplistic view, but let's go back to a little bit of the history of how Germany got here. Do remember that Germany was united into a country only in 1870.
Yeah.
So earlier it was actually a network of small kingdoms. And each one of these small kingdoms had a capital and some sort of a hub. When it then got united into a country in 1870 by Bismarck, these hubs were all over the place. So the way they worked, rather than the way it worked in other countries. So there are other developed countries where the logic worked differently. Okay. So for example, in the UK, there were very large clusters. So there were 3 very large clusters. One was in around London. There was one in the Midlands around Birmingham. And there was another further north in the north of England. There were 3 big hubs, and that's basically where it happened. And then it has now a lot of deindustrialization has happened. So London has remained as the main hub now.
Okay.
Same thing has happened with France, with Paris. Paris is overwhelmingly the largest economic hub of. So this has not happened in Germany, partly because of history and the dispersed nature of it. Even in India, so history very often plays a role. So if you look at Gujarat, for example, Gujarat, because it was dispersed into a number of small kingdoms, interestingly, even today, it has large numbers of economic hubs. It has got, you'll have Rajkot, Ahmedabad, Surat, Baroda, and so on. They're all, by the way, many of these were capitals of small kingdoms and so on. I'll give the contrast with that with, say, West Bengal, which had, one major hub, Kolkata, and so on. So history does play a role in some of it. how it develops. And sometimes the highly concentrated model can also be extremely successful. I mean, Japan has an extremely concentrated model with one really big city in Tokyo and then one or two other hubs, Osaka or whatever. But Osaka is much, much smaller than Tokyo. So let's not confuse success with the peculiarities of a decentralized model of Germany. Nevertheless, Germany does it in this particular way. Now, Germany's model, which I think the more interesting part is, I mean, there is the issue of decentralization, which is in urban design and geographical, and that's a different conversation. Let me focus on this business of small specialized companies, Mittelstadt basically, which does an amazing job. And I think here also we tend to overstate the case. Many of these Mittelstadts feed into larger companies. So do remember that they are not entirely independent bodies from the bigger companies that they feed into. Nevertheless, it is true that Germany has this culture of many of these companies, and they have done an amazing job. So there is many things why it succeeds in doing this. One of them, of course, is this amazing system of apprenticeships that they have, where people they're there, and there is many other reasons for it. But the point that you made about Germany competing on quality and China competing on price is actually no longer true. China now is rapidly competing in quality as well. There are many areas where they are genuinely at the cutting edge, and much of that technology is learned from, stolen, whatever you prefer, from the Germans. So I think one of the real big problems that Germany will now have is being able to compete with this rapid growth of China and which is moving up the value chain and doing. So I personally don't think there is a choice that India has of competing, going the German way or the Chinese way. The Chinese way competes on both fronts. And in many ways, while we cannot exactly replicate their model because our political system is different, etc., but there are a few very key things to learn here. First of all, go into an industry and in the beginning, do not get emotional about where in the value chain you are. Okay? Even if there is a big industry and all you're doing there is turning the screws, go into it. That's how China got into electronics, right? The first thing they were doing was just pure assembly. True. So do not, many people in India said, why are we only going into, the lower end? We should go into the higher end. Hello. Before you can run, you have to walk. The same, very often you'll hear these sort of derogatory terms about, Indians are only doing cyber coolie work. Well, actually, you have to start by being a cyber coolie. In fact, India's entire software industry is based on a non-event. It's called Y2K. So don't have any emotions about dirtying your hands at the bottom of the pyramid. But then you have to have ambition. And, we have now shown ambition. Indians are showing ambition in the sense that you see when you say artificial intelligence is being developed by these top Google, is that the other. Do remember that a lot of this is developed in India by Indians in the captives of these companies in India. Number one. Number two, the ambition that we have of moving up the value chain of Indian companies doing it. That, I think, is something we need to encourage. So it's not the lack of ability of Indians. After all, Apple is increasingly making its phones in India. Foreign companies are able to, compete in various markets around the world based on Indian research, Indian development, R&D, and all kinds of things. Even Google Maps, that is used worldwide, is an Indian invention. It was invented in the Indian offices of Google. So Indians are able to do it. The question is, why is India's corporate sector? And I have now, for the last half an hour, 40 minutes, criticized Indian bureaucracy, government, etc., and the need to reform them. I think this is a criticism I can fairly make about India's corporate sector. Again, the lack of ambition. Okay, it is extraordinary that Indian companies, which are now global size companies, they are not small companies anymore. They are hugely profitable for the last several years, and the amount of R&D Indian companies do is ludicrous for their size. Okay, Indian generics manufacturers. Okay, they're not small companies. Why aren't they the guys who are now creating cutting-edge molecules? Maybe there are some rules and regulations, etc., that we need to change on the India side. Yeah, fair. That's what the government needs to do. But I think a large part of it is simply lack of ambition on our corporate sector. And the poverty of aspiration, which I often blame on other parts of the system, needs to also is also true of our corporate sector.
Poverty of aspiration.
Absolutely.
Like that word,
Why are Indian companies not aspiring to be world leaders in certain things? And that will require you to invest in R&D. You go into the R&D departments of Indian companies, large Indian companies, and there are some notable exceptions. So, I'm painting them with a broad brush. But generally speaking, you wanted those German Mittelstand company, go and see them. Small companies doing enormous amount of research.
True.
Okay. Is it because our education system is not generating great scientists? I'm sorry, you go and meet these Mittelstand, they come from very mid-level, it's not the top engineering colleges in Germany, it's the middle ones. Even some of them have just been apprenticeships, so they're not highly educated in that sense. But there is a culture of continuous innovation that happens. Here, there is an unwillingness to dirty your hands. And that is very important. It's the engineers who need to run Indian companies. And it really bothers me that even where engineers did create Indian companies, the next generation of those family-owned companies then become basically MBAs and become managers.
True.
They are not the guys going back there and doing masters in chemical engineering. Their dad who set up the company was a chemical engineer. This guy is a pretty boy who has got an MBA from fancy school in America, good at PowerPoint, but cannot actually fix the machine. And this is an issue. So I think we need to get serious about a culture that does this. And this, as I keep going, we Indians are not being ambitious enough at multiple levels.
So the two things that you mentioned that I found very interesting are the poverty of aspiration, and number two is education. I want to dig deeper into poverty of aspiration. I actually spoke to a lot of these MSME owners and manufacturers, and what they often complain about is the Chinese dumping the products in the market. So if they're producing something at 5 rupees, the Chinese dump it in the market at 4 rupees. So there is no way they could make a profit. And when I spoke to them about why don't they invest into R&D, one primary reason that they pointed out is the lack of capital. And that is when I started reading about Okin, which India is recently getting into. And that is what made me think that the MSME sector of India employs 100 million people. It contributes close to 50% to our exports. And yet, it is one of those sectors which is just struggling for capital. Why is that, sir? Why is that?
So there are many reasons for it. And I could give a long lecture on, how we can improve this. First of all, we need to lower the cost of capital in this country. I think that is something that will happen naturally as we become a more developed country. The cleaning up of the banks was an important part. Bringing back a credit culture. Because remember, if there's poor credit culture, then the good debtors are paying for the bad debtors.
True.
Right? So I think we need to lower the cost of capital in this country significantly. Some of it has happened.
Okay.
If you look at the equity markets today, good companies are getting massive premiums. No problem getting capital. So maybe historically true, but at least at the margin, this problem is becoming much, much lesser of a binding. Similarly, if you have a really good startup and you have a great idea, you will get money. So I think at the margin, this problem is dissolving itself. There is, however, two problems. One is, again, going back to my earlier discussion we had about the rep tapeism that is still embedded in our system. It's not big things very often. The big things have in fact been resolved. It's the continuous fiction of regulation. over-regulation, harassment, and rent-seeking. That at the ground level is a major restraining factor on middle-level companies growing. But I will say that we need to, there is a general national problem of poverty of aspiration that we have. A lot of our talent, for example, in this country, would rather, spend years doing the UPSC exam, with a 99.9% failure rate, than take a risk in pursuing a business or some other profession. Don't you have to become a writer or an athlete or something else, some form of risk taking, even though your success rates are higher there.
True.
So therefore, there is a culture problem here, which cannot be solved by the government. It is something we as a people have to begin to think about. After all, the same people go abroad. I mean, I cannot believe that people go abroad to the US and make a fortune, or go to Dubai or UK and make a fortune, right? How do they do this? Why are we able to do this more successfully outside of our own country than in India? The same person's cousin, who is equally talented, is unable to do it. Why? Because I think one part of it is this whole red tapeism, the whole thing. But some part of it we will have to accept as a society is a poverty of aspiration, which restrains you when you live here, but you get liberated from when you are forced to do something in some other society.
Mm-hmm. So I think the only difference between India and the US, and you just mentioned that the same person goes on to do extraordinary things in the US, I think that is primarily because of the education system, sir. Our education system, and I'm so sorry to say this, it is just beyond pathetic, sir. And I am the perfect byproduct of the education system. My college had a rule of 75% attendance. I did my civil engineering, and we were building something called sewage treatment plant. And my professor actually wrote a stat on the board which said that if the population increases by 30% year on year, this is the amount of waste that is going to increase. So calculate the amount of waste and then build an STP. And the first argument that I put forth was that if the population grows at 30%, we are going to collapse. So aren't we supposed to think about how are we going to reduce the amount of waste that each person puts out rather than building an STP? And he had no answer to that. And that is a clear indication of, I would say that's a clear anecdotal evidence of how our education system functions.
No, there's a lot of problem with our education system. So there are two problems here. Is a lack of performance due to education system alone? And two, should we improve the education system? I think the two should be separated. Okay. The reason is, you see what happens is this debate otherwise goes into the following. Let's fix the education system and then we will get growth. Actually, this is not how the world has functioned. Okay. China grew with bad education system. Most of the guys who created these great companies are not very well educated. Please go and meet the average Chinese billionaire. He's not very well educated. Dhirubhai Ambani was not as well educated as his descendants are, but he created. So first of all, this whole idea that we know first we have to improve our education system, then at some point, I'm sorry, if you go back and look at all the great companies of today in America with that great education system, okay, let me tell you, Bill Gates, college dropout, Zuckerberg, college dropout, you have many of the guys today may have an undergraduate degree, So the point I'm making is that first of all, this is part of that poverty of aspiration that we have, is that we will do only after finishing a PhD can you do some great thing. No, that is the wrong way of thinking about it. In fact, that is some part of our colonization of being clerks. That you can only do great things if you remain within the nice British education system and work your way up, grade 1 to grade 2 clerk and so on. So this is part of that problem. So please, I'm all for improving the education system, but let us please separate this from the need to get on with a more innovative economy, more risk-taking, all of this is a cultural issue. It is not an education issue. Okay? So So I want to make this clear, because otherwise we go into this circular thing. However, we do need to improve our education system, because there are benefits from that too. Here, I would say, we could spend the next 30, 40 years trying to fix each college. I think it's too difficult to do this. My own view is that the way we deliver education worldwide, not just in India, is already too outdated. It's a 19th century idea of giving lectures. Okay, why do we need to give the same lecture in every college worldwide when we have YouTube? You just need to give a good lecture once and everybody on the planet can watch it. Okay, and then answering questions can be done by artificial intelligence. I mean, how often will there be one person in thousands who will ask a unique question which AI cannot answer? Okay, for that you can have one supervisory professor. So the reason I'm making this line of thought out to you is this. While you may need still for primary education, the old classroom kind of thing, just to get people on the rails, a lot of tertiary education can be automated on a mass scale. I am a firm believer that tertiary education can be made almost free.
Okay.
Okay? Colleges should not be wasting their time on giving lectures. They should become places for research. They should become certification and testing systems, but giving particularly undergraduate level lectures is a complete waste of time. Okay? Now, in some subjects, you may need, like medical, etc., you need to have hands-on, so fine, this will not apply to them. But I can't see why my subject, economics, cannot be completely automated except for special projects. So you go to college, you do some special project, maybe a few testing, and what happens then is you can dramatically expand the amount of people who study these subjects, infinitely, in fact. So I believe that, we are trying to solve the problem in the wrong way.
Sir, I'd actually disagree with that lecture thing, and I'll tell you why. The example that I gave you about my professor, my own best friend, when he went to the US, he was given a very similar problem statement, but the difference in approach was that the professor conducted the lecture to provoke a particular discussion and debate about the entire town.
So fine. Therefore, you need to have face-to-face interaction for doing a limited number of projects.
True.
Fine, do it. But just imagine if I then completely automate this lecturing business. Okay? And then the same professor can take 500 classes instead of taking 5.
True.
Because he's only taking, doing the things where face-to-face interaction, that you do projects. There are places where you need human interaction. I agree with you. But just imagine the same IIT campus. Today you're sending there people for 4 years, they're sitting that whole campus. Now, a few times a year you call in people to do these things that are needed. Otherwise, it's all automated and you have tests. And it's not like people can't use their time to do other things. And then we create a much more apprentice-based system. Let young people go and work. Let them go into the factory floor. And we are all talking about German system. The German system is based on apprenticeship. I mean, throughout history, 18-year-olds used to work. What's the big deal? Even today, some of our most skilled people are doing this. Correct. Think of getting a chartered accountancy degree. Chartered accountancy is not based on your BCom. Most of those guys are working. They are taking most of their classes online. And you are creating chartered accountancy, highly skilled job. Correct. Okay. Now, you are able to create them. Now, you cannot tell me that you cannot create lower skilled activities like economists. I'm sorry, it is not a very high skilled job. Okay, they are good economists and bad economists, that's a different issue. But it is actually requires less face-to-face interaction. A lot of economics can be generally taught. And then take these guys, the skill of economics is in the doing. Put them into think tanks. Put them into policy making. Put them in financial markets. Okay, no amount of lecturing will teach you economics better than having your fingers burnt in a market crash. Let me tell you this.
So you're saying that, sir, we have to strike a perfect balance between automation, thought-provoking lectures, and apprenticeship, which will give the student...
Yes. So now the point I'm making is the model I'm saying is actually cheaper. The guy is working. He's spending less time doing useless lectures, which he can anyway do online. In fact, why does he even have to listen to his college lecturer? He can listen to the best in the world.
So why haven't we done this in the past 10 years?
No. There are two reasons for it. One is it was not possible till relatively recently. It takes some time for systems to catch up. The second is, as with any innovation, the incumbents of the system will resist it. So today's academia is not going to be deeply happy about this any more than lawyers are going to be happy with AI-driven legal systems, or in the past, I mentioned, the clerks in Kolkata being deeply unhappy about introduction of computerization. The same thing will happen here. The difference is that obviously academia has much greater control over narrative building. So they are going to resist this. But I'm telling you, this is the future.
So the last question that I have is about GST, and this is something that I asked Nirmala ma'am also. So I just thought I would get a much better answer from you, more elaboratively. And this is about GST being a consumption tax and not a production-based tax. So just to put it in context for the audience, if 100 rupees worth of t-shirt is sold, 18 rupees GST is collected. Out of that, 9 goes to the center, 9 goes to the state. And this 9 rupees that goes to the state, it goes to the consumer state, which is, let's say, UP, and not the producer state, which is Tamil Nadu. And here's where governments like Tamil Nadu often argue that when we are the ones who have spent so much into building factories and incentivizing these businesses, why are the consumer states gaining benefit out of it and not us? So how do you explain that, sir?
So there are two parts of it. First of all, let me talk. People need to understand why there are multiple points of taxation. Many people love to say, we should have one tax and everybody pays it. No. You see, the moment you create one tax, the entire economy will change itself to not have to pay that one tax. So you need multiple points, hopefully light taxation, so that people can be captured in the tax web in multiple ways. So you do need direct taxes, which are more towards the producers, if you can call it. And then there are the consumption end taxes. Now, that is the indirect taxes and direct taxes. So first of all, you need both of them. If you have only one and too much of one, the entire economy will fit itself, it will change itself to try and avoid that one tax. So
okay.
That's one. Two, about this distribution. Well, first of all, the producer state is benefiting massively from many of these things as well. It's not the case. After all, jobs are being created in that state. There are, more workers. Consequently, they are also consuming. They are also consumers. So the producer state benefits massively from having production in their state. To say that they do not benefit from it is utterly wrong. Now, of course, the consumer is an important part of the equation. And by the way, there are many offsets along the way. So it's not like because the consumption is happening in the last point, they're getting all the taxes. There is a whole bunch of people along. At each point, the tax is being paid. So if further up somebody produced thread, they got an offset. So it's not like the last guy is getting. In fact, that is one of the points about GST, that's a value-added based. It is not based on sales, and therefore the final point. So I'm not certain that your example is even accurate. Okay? Now, well, the fact of the matter is that we do have a system where I personally think it's a reasonably fair system. You can change it around, but let me tell you, I'm not going to solve it. If there are large consumer states, it is fair. There are probably also large population states, and they need more taxes. If for whatever reason you have higher growth in your state, including these production capacities, you are presumably also generating higher GST from, you have, after all, T-shirts is not the only place GST is there. Cement, you're getting higher from construction material, from the fact that workers, many of them may be from UP who have now moved to Tirupur. So I am not so sympathetic to these kinds of arguments as maybe you may think. But occasionally you may require to do some balancing. But generally speaking, a simple system that applies to the whole is probably the better thing. I am much more sympathetic to simplifying those slabs, simplifying categorizations, getting rid of bugs in the website. And so on and so forth.
Okay. Sir, if it was so straightforward, then why did we introduce the GST compensation?
Because there was an earlier system.
Okay.
There was an earlier system. You cannot suddenly change to one system and say that, overnight all our my expenditures are based on a certain framework. But you have been given a long time to transition. So that it was a transition thing. We all agreed as a country that this is a better system. And I don't think anybody seriously wants to go back to the old system. And if you want to, please go and talk to people how things work before 20. You see, people love criticizing the current system, which is perfectly fine for improving it, but never try to go back to, that shouldn't be under no circumstances an argument for going back to the earlier system, which was a disaster. I mean, there were multiple taxes, there were state boundaries, it was an absolute mess. So there is now been a transition. State government should have adjusted to that transition. We provided compensation for it. In fact, for COVID also extra compensation time was given. So this thing has been extended longer than these would have been the case. Now, states do need to play by the current system.
Understood, sir. Thank you so much for your time, sir. It really means a lot. I was able to understand everything, and I just hope everybody else also understood. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.